Chapter 22. Only inside the entrance did Vinicius comprehend the whole difficulty of the undertaking. The house was large, of several stories, one of the kind of which thousands were built in Rome, in view of profit from rent. Hence, as a rule, they were built so hurriedly and badly that scarcely a year passed in which numbers of them did not fall on the heads of tenants. Real hives, too high and too narrow, full of chambers and little dens, in which poor people fixed themselves too numerously. In a city where many streets had no names, those houses had no numbers, the owners committed the collection of rent to slaves, who, not obliged by the city government to give names of occupants, were ignorant themselves of them frequently. To find someone by inquiry in such a house was often very difficult, especially when there was no gatekeeper. Vinicius and Croton came to a narrow, corridor-like passage walled in on four sides, forming a kind of common atrium for the whole house, with a fountain in the middle whose stream fell into a stone basin fixed in the ground. At all the walls were internal stairways, some of stone, some of wood, leading to galleries from which there were entrances to lodgings. There were lodgings on the ground, also, some provided with wooden doors, others separated from the yard by woolen screens only. These, for the greater part, were worn, rent, or patched. The hour was early, and there was not a living soul in the yard. It was evident that all were asleep in the house except those who had returned from Austrianum. "What shall we do, Lord?" asked Croton, halting. "Let us wait here. Someone may appear," replied Vinicius. "We should not be seen in the yard." At this moment, he thought Shiloh's counsel practical. If there were some tens of slaves present, it would be easy to occupy the gate, which seemed the only exit, search all the lodgings simultaneously, and thus come to Ligia's. Otherwise Christians, who surely were not lacking in that house, might give notice that people were seeking her. In view of this, there was risk in inquiring of strangers. Vinicius stopped to think whether it would not be better to go for his slaves. Just then, from behind a screen hiding a remoter lodging, came a man with a sieve in his hand, and approached the fountain. At the first glance the young tribune recognized Ursus. "That is the Lygian," whispered Vinicius. "Am I to break his bones now? Wait a while." Ursus did not notice the two men, as they were in the shadow of the entrance, and he began quietly to sink in water vegetables which filled the sieve. It was evident that, after a whole night spent in the cemetery, he intended to prepare a meal. After a while the washing was finished, he took the wet sieve and disappeared behind the screen. Croton and Vinicius followed him, thinking that they would come directly to Ligia's lodgings. Their astonishment was great when they saw that the screen divided from the court, not lodgings, but another dark corridor, at the end of which was a little garden containing a few cypresses, some myrtle bushes, and a small house fixed to the windowless stone wall of another stone building. Both understood at once that this was for them a favoring circumstance. In the courtyard all the tenants might assemble. The seclusion of the little house facilitated the enterprise. They would set aside defenders, or rather Ursus, quickly, and would reach the street just as quickly with the captured Ligia, and there they would help themselves. It was likely that no one would attack them. If attacked, they would say that a hostage was fleeing from Caesar. Vinicius would declare himself then to the guards, and summon their assistance. Ursus was almost entering the little house, when the sound of steps attracted his attention. He halted, and, seeing two persons, put his sieve on the balustrade and turned to them. "What do you want here?" asked he. Said Vinicius. Then, turning to Croton, he said in a low, hurried voice, "Kill." Croton rushed at him like a tiger, and in one moment, before the Lygian was able to think or to recognize his enemies, Croton had caught him in his arms of steel. Vinicius was too confident in the man's preternatural strength to wait for the end of the struggle. He passed the two, sprang to the door of the little house, pushed it open and found himself in a room a trifle dark, lighted, however, by a fire burning in the chimney. A gleam of this fire fell on Ligia's face directly. A second person, sitting at the fire, was that old man who had accompanied the young girl and Ursus on the road from Austrianum. Vinicius rushed in so suddenly that before Ligia could recognize him he had seized her by the waist, and, raising her, rushed toward the door again. The old man barred the way, it is true, but pressing the girl with one arm to his breast, Vinicius pushed him aside with the other, which was free. The hood fell from his head, and at sight of that face, which was known to her and which at that moment was terrible, The blood grew cold in Lygia from fright, and the voice died in her throat. She wished to summon aid, but had not the power. Equally vain was her wish to grasp the door, to resist. Her fingers slipped along the stone, and she would have fainted but for the terrible picture which struck her eyes when Vinicius rushed into the garden. Ursus was holding in his arms some man doubled back completely, with hanging head and mouth filled with blood. When he saw them, he struck the head once more with his fist, and in the twinkle of an eye sprang toward Vinicius like a raging wild beast. Death, thought the young patrician. Then he heard, as through a dream, the scream of Lygia, "Kill not!" He felt that something, as it were a thunderbolt, opened the arms with which he held Lygia. Then the earth turned round with him, and the light of day died in his eyes. Shiloh, hidden behind the angle of the corner house, was waiting for what would happen, since curiosity was struggling with fear in him. He thought that if they succeeded in carrying off Lygia, he would fare well near Vinicius. He feared Urban no longer, for he also felt certain that Croton would kill him. And he calculated that in case a gathering should begin on the streets, which so far were empty, if Christians, or people of any kind, should offer resistance, he, Shiloh, would speak to them as one representing authority, as an executor of Caesar's will, and if need came, call the guards to aid the young patrician against the street rabble, thus winning to himself fresh favor. In his soul he judged yet that the young tribune's method was unwise, considering, however, Croton's terrible strength. He admitted that it might succeed, and thought, if it go hard with him, Vinicius can carry the girl, and Croton clear the way. Delay grew wearisome, however. The silence of the entrance which he watched alarmed him. If they do not hit upon her hiding place, and make an uproar, they will frighten her. But this thought was not disagreeable, for Shiloh understood that in that event he would be necessary again to Vinicius, and could squeeze afresh a goodly number of sestertia from the tribune. Whatever they do, said he to himself, they will work for me, though no one divines that. O gods, only permit me. And he stopped suddenly, for it seemed to him that someone was bending forward through the entrance. Then, squeezing up to the wall, he began to look, holding the breath in his breast. And he had not deceived himself, for a head thrust itself half out of the entrance and looked around. After a while, however, it vanished. That is Vinicius, or Croton, thought Shiloh, but if they have taken the girl, why does she not scream, and why are they looking out to the street? They must meet people anyhow, for before they reach the Carina there will be movement in the city. What is that? By the immortal gods! And suddenly the remnant of his hair stood on end. In the door appeared Ursus, with the body of Croton hanging on his arm, and looking around once more, he began to run, bearing it along the empty street toward the river. Shiloh made himself as flat against the wall as a bit of mud. I am lost if he sees me, thought he. But Ursus ran past the corner quickly, and disappeared beyond the neighboring house. Shiloh, without further waiting, his teeth chattering from terror, ran along the cross street with a speed which even in a young man might have roused admiration. If he sees me from a distance when he is returning, he will catch and kill me, said he to himself. Save me, Zeus, save me, Apollo, save me, Hermes, save me, O God of the Christians. I will leave Rome, I will return to Mesembria, but save me from the hands of that demon. And that Lygian who had killed Croton seemed to him at that moment some superhuman being. While running, he thought that he might be some god who had taken the form of a barbarian. At that moment he believed in all the gods of the world, and in all myths, at which he jeered usually. It flew through his head, too, that it might be the god of the Christians who had killed Croton, and his hair stood on end again at the thought that he was in conflict with such a power. Only when he had run through a number of alleys, and saw some workmen coming toward him from a distance, was he calmed somewhat. Breath failed in his breast, so he sat on the threshold of a house and began to wipe, with a corner of his mantle, his sweat-covered forehead. I am old, and need calm, said he. The people coming toward him turned into some little side street, and again the place round about was empty. The city was sleeping yet. In the morning movement began earlier in the wealthier parts of the city, where the slaves of rich houses were forced to rise before daylight. In portions inhabited by a free population, supported at the cost of the state, hence unoccupied, they woke rather late, especially in winter. Shiloh, after he had sat some time on the threshold, felt a piercing cold, so he rose, and, convincing himself that he had not lost the purse received from Vinicius, turned toward the river with a step now much slower. "I may see Croton's body somewhere," said he to himself. "O gods! That Lygian, if he is a man, might make millions of sestertia in the course of 1 year, for if he choked Croton, like a whelp, who can resist him? They would give for his every appearance in the arena as much gold as he himself weighs. He guards that maiden better than Cerberus does Hades. But may Hades swallow him, for all that, I will have nothing to do with him. He is too bony. But where shall I begin in this case? A dreadful thing has happened. If he has broken the bones of such a man as Croton, beyond a doubt the soul of Vinicius is puling above that cursed house now, awaiting his burial by Castor. But he is a patrician, a friend of Caesar, a relative of Petronius, a man known in all Rome, a military tribune. His death cannot pass without punishment. Suppose I were to go to the praetorian camp, or the guards of the city, for instance." Here he stopped and began to think, but said after a while, "Woe is me! Who took him to that house if not I? His freedmen and his slaves know that I came to his house, and some of them know with what object. What will happen if they suspect me of having pointed out to him purposely the house in which his death met him, though it appear afterward, in the court, that I did not wish his death? They will say that I was the cause of it. Besides, he is a patrician, hence in no event can I avoid punishment. But if I leave Rome in silence, and go far away somewhere, I shall place myself under still greater suspicion." It was bad in every case. The only question was to choose the less evil. Rome was immense. Still Shiloh felt that it might become too small for him. Any other man might go directly to the prefect of the city guards and tell what had happened, and, though some suspicion might fall on him, await the issue calmly. But Shiloh's whole past was of such character that every closer acquaintance with the prefect of the city or the prefect of the guard must cause him very serious trouble, and confirm also every suspicion which might enter the heads of officials. On the other hand, to flee would be to confirm Petronius in the opinion that Vinicius had been betrayed and murdered through conspiracy. Petronius was a powerful man, who could command the police of the whole empire, and who beyond doubt would try to find the guilty parties even at the ends of the earth. Still, Shiloh thought to go straight to him, and tell what had happened. Yes, that was the best plan. Petronius was calm, and Shiloh might be sure of this, at least, that he would hear him to the end. Petronius, who knew the affair from its inception, would believe in Shiloh's innocence more easily than would the prefects. But to go to him, it was needful to know with certainty what had happened to Vinicius. Shiloh did not know that. He had seen, it is true, the Lygian stealing with Croton's body to the river, but nothing more. Vinicius might be killed, but he might be wounded or detained. Now it occurred to Shiloh for the first time, that surely the Christians would not dare to kill a man so powerful, a friend of Caesar, and a high military official, for that kind of act might draw on them a general persecution. It was more likely that they had detained him by superior force, to give Lygia means to hide herself a second time. This thought filled Shiloh with hope. If that Lygian dragon has not torn him to pieces at the first attack, he is alive, and if he is alive he himself will testify that I have not betrayed him, and then not only does nothing threaten me, but O Hermes, count again on 2 heifers, a fresh field is opening. I can inform one of the freedmen where to seek his lord, and whether he goes to the prefect or not is his affair, the only point being that I should not go. Also, I can go to Petronius, and count on a reward. I have found Ligia, now I shall find Vinicius, and then again Lygia. It is needful to know first whether Vinicius is dead or living. Here it occurred to him that he might go in the night to the baker Demas and inquire about Ursus. But he rejected that thought immediately. He preferred to have nothing to do with Ursus. He might suppose, justly, that if Ursus had not killed Glaucus he had been warned, evidently, by the Christian elder to whom he had confessed his design, warned that the affair was an unclean one, to which some traitor had persuaded him. In every case, at the mere recollection of Ursus, a shiver ran through Shiloh's whole body. But he thought that in the evening he would send Eurystheus for news to that house in which the thing had happened. Meanwhile he needed refreshment, a bath, and rest. The sleepless night, the journey to Ostranium, the flight from the Trans-Tiber, had wearied him exceedingly. One thing gave him permanent comfort. He had on his person 2 purses, that which Vinicius had given him at home, and that which he had thrown him on the way from the cemetery. In view of this happy circumstance, and of all the excitement through which he had passed, he resolved to eat abundantly, and drink better wine than he drank usually. When the hour for opening the wine shop came at last, he did so in such a marked measure that he forgot the bath. He wished to sleep, above all, and drowsiness overcame his strength so that he returned with tottering step to his dwelling in the Suburra, where a slave woman, purchased with money obtained from Vinicius, was waiting for him. When he had entered a sleeping room, as dark as the den of a fox, he threw himself on the bed, and fell asleep in one instant. He woke only in the evening, or rather he was roused by the slave woman, who called him to rise, for someone was inquiring, and wished to see him on urgent business. The watchful Shiloh came to himself in one moment, threw on his hooded mantle hastily, and, commanding the slave woman to stand aside, looked out cautiously. And he was benumbed, for he saw before the door of the sleeping room the gigantic form of Ursus. At that sight he felt his feet and head grow icy cold, the heart ceased to beat in his bosom, and shivers were creeping along his back. For a time he was unable to speak, then with chattering teeth he said, or rather groaned, "Sire, I am not at home. I don't know that good man." "I told him that thou wert at home, but asleep, Lord," answered the girl. "He asked to rouse thee." "O gods, I will command that thou—" But Ursus, as if impatient of delay, approached the door of the sleeping room, and, bending, thrust in his head. "O Shiloh Chilonides," said he. "Pax tecum." "Pax, Pax," answered Shiloh. "O best of Christians." "Yes, I am Shiloh, but this is a mistake. I do not know thee." "Shiloh Chilonides," repeated Ursus. "Thy lord, Vinicius, summons thee to go with me to him." Chapter 23. A piercing pain roused Vinicius. At the first moment he could not understand where he was, nor what was happening. He felt a roaring in his head, and his eyes were covered as if with mist. Gradually, however, his consciousness returned, and at last he beheld through that mist 3 persons bending over him. 2 he recognized, one was Ursus, the other the old man whom he had thrust aside when carrying off Lygia. The third, an utter stranger, was holding his left arm, and feeling it from the elbow upward as far as the shoulder blade. This caused so terrible a pain that Vinicius, thinking it a kind of revenge which they were taking, said through his set teeth, "Kill me." But they paid no apparent heed to his words, just as though they heard them not, or considered them the usual groans of suffering. Ursus, with his anxious and also threatening face of a barbarian, held a bundle of white cloth torn in long strips. The old man spoke to the person who was pressing the arm of Vinicius. "Glaucus, art thou certain that the wound in the head is not mortal?" "Yes, worthy Crispus," answered Glaucus. "While serving in the fleet as a slave, and afterward while living at Naples, I cured many wounds, and with the pay which came to me from that occupation I freed myself and my relatives at last. The wound in the head is slight." When this one, here he pointed to Ursus with his head, took the girl from the young man, he pushed him against the wall. The young man while falling put out his arm, evidently to save himself. He broke and disjointed it, but by so doing saved his head and his life. "Thou hast had more than one of the brotherhood in thy care," added Crispus, "and hast the repute of a skillful physician. Therefore I sent Ursus to bring thee." Ursus, who on the road confessed that yesterday he was ready to kill me. "He confessed his intention earlier to me than to thee. But I, who know thee and thy love for Christ, explained to him that the traitor is not thou, but the unknown, who tried to persuade him to murder." "That was an evil spirit, but I took him for an angel," said Ursus, with a sigh. "Some other time thou wilt tell me, but now we must think of this wounded man." Thus speaking, he began to set the arm. Though Crispus sprinkled water on his face, Vinicius fainted repeatedly from suffering. That was, however, a fortunate circumstance, since he did not feel the pain of putting his arm into joint, nor of setting it. Glaucus fixed the limb between 2 strips of wood, which he bound quickly and firmly, so as to keep the arm motionless. When the operation was over, Vinicius recovered consciousness again and saw Lygia above him. She stood there at the bed holding a brass basin with water, in which from time to time Glaucus dipped a sponge and moistened the head of his patient. Vinicius gazed and could not believe his eyes. What he saw seemed a dream, or the pleasant vision brought by fever, and only after a long time could he whisper, Lygia. The basin trembled in her hand at that sound, but she turned on him eyes full of sadness. "Peace be with thee," answered she, in a low voice. She stood there with extended arms, her face full of pity and sorrow. But he gazed, as if to fill his sight with her, so that after his lids were closed the picture might remain under them. He looked at her face, paler and smaller than it had been, at the tresses of dark hair, at the poor dress of a laboring woman. He looked so intently that her snowy forehead began to grow rose-colored under the influence of his look. And first he thought that he would love her always, and second, that paleness of hers and that poverty were his work, that it was he who had driven her from a house where she was loved, and surrounded with plenty and comfort, and thrust her into that squalid room, and clothed her in that poor robe of dark wool. He would have arrayed her in the costliest brocade, in all the jewels of the earth. Hence astonishment, alarm, and pity seized him, and sorrow so great that he would have fallen at her feet had he been able to move. "Lygia," said he, "thou didst not permit my death." "May God return health to thee," she answered, with sweetness. For Vinicius, who had a feeling both of those wrongs which he had inflicted on her formerly, and those which he had wished to inflict on her recently, there was a real balsam in Lygia's words. He forgot at the moment that through her mouth Christian teaching might speak. He felt only that a beloved woman was speaking, and that in her answer there was a special tenderness, a goodness simply preterhuman, which shook him to the depth of his soul. As just before he had grown weak from pain, so now he grew weak from emotion. A certain faintness came on him, at once immense and agreeable. He felt as if falling into some abyss, but he felt that to fall was pleasant, and that he was happy. He thought at that moment of weakness that a divinity was standing above him. Meanwhile Glaucus had finished washing the wound in his head, and had applied a healing ointment. Ursus took the brass basin from Lygia's hands. She brought a cup of water and wine which stood ready on the table, and put it to the wounded man's lips. Vinicius drank eagerly, and felt great relief. After the operation the pain had almost passed, the wound and contusion began to grow firm. Perfect consciousness returned to him. "Give me another drink," said he. Lygia took the empty cup to the next room. Meanwhile Crispus, after a few words with Glaucus, approached the bed saying, "God has not permitted thee, Vinicius, to accomplish an evil deed, and has preserved thee in life so that thou shouldst come to thy mind. He, before whom man is but dust, delivered thee defenseless into our hands, but Christ, in whom we believe, commanded us to love even our enemies. Therefore we have dressed thy wounds, and, as Lygia has said, we will implore God to restore thy health, but we cannot watch over thee longer. Be in peace, then, and think whether it beseems thee to continue thy pursuit of Lygia. Thou hast deprived her of guardians, and us of a roof, though we return thee good for evil." "Do you wish to leave me?" inquired Vinicius. "We wish to leave this house, in which prosecution by the prefect of the city may reach us. Thy companion was killed, thou, who art powerful among thy own people, art wounded. This did not happen through our fault, but the anger of the law might fall on us." "Have no fear of prosecution," replied Vinicius, "I will protect you." Crispus did not like to tell him that with them it was not only a question of the prefect and the police, but of him. They wished to secure Lygia from his further pursuit. "Lord," said he, "thy right arm is well. Here are tablets and a stylus. Write to thy servants to bring a litter this evening and bear thee to thy own house, where thou wilt have more comfort than in our poverty. We dwell here with a poor widow, who will return soon with her son, and this youth will take thy letter. As to us, we must all find another hiding place." Vinicius grew pale, for he understood that they wished to separate him from Lygia, and that if he lost her now he might never see her in life again. He knew indeed that things of great import had come between him and her, in virtue of which, if he wished to possess her, he must seek some new methods which he had not had time yet to think over. He understood too that whatever he might tell these people, though he should swear that he would return Lygia to Pomponia Graecina, they would not believe him, and were justified in refusing belief. Moreover, he might have done that before. Instead of hunting for Lygia, he might have gone to Pomponia and sworn to her that he renounced pursuit, and in that case Pomponia herself would have found Lygia and brought her home. No, he felt that such promises would not restrain them, and no solemn oath would be received, the more since, not being a Christian, he could swear only by the immortal gods, in whom he did not himself believe greatly, and whom they considered evil spirits. He desired desperately to influence Lygia and her guardians in some way, but for that there was need of time. For him it was all important to see her, to look at her for a few days even. As every fragment of a plank or an oar seems salvation to a drowning man, so to him it seemed that during those few days he might say something to bring him nearer to her, that he might think out something, that something favorable might happen. Hence he collected his thoughts and said, "Listen to me, Christians. Yesterday I was with you in Austrianum, and I heard your teaching, but though I did not know it, your deeds have convinced me that you are honest and good people. Tell that widow who occupies this house to stay in it yourselves, and let me stay. Let this man," here he turned to Glaucus, "who is a physician, or at least understands the care of wounds, tell whether it is possible to carry me from here today. I am sick, I have a broken arm, which must remain immovable for a few days even, therefore I declare to you that I will not leave this house unless you bear me hence by force." Here he stopped, for breath failed in his breast, and Crispus said, "We will use no force against thee, Lord, we will only take away our own heads." At this the young man, unused to resistance, frowned and said, "Permit me to recover breath." And after a time he began again to speak, of Croton, whom Ursus killed, no one will inquire. He had to go to Data Beneventum, whither he was summoned by Vadinius, therefore all will think that he has gone there. When I entered this house in company with Croton, no one saw us except a Greek who was with us in Austrianum. I will indicate to you his lodgings, bring that man to me. On him I will enjoin silence, he is paid by me. I will send a letter to my own house stating that I too went to Beneventum. If the Greek has informed the prefect already, I will declare that I myself killed Croton, and that it was he who broke my arm. I will do this, by my father's shade and by my mother's. Ye may remain in safety here, not a hair will fall from the head of one of you. Bring hither, and bring in haste, the Greek whose name is Chilonides. Then Glaucus will remain with thee, said Crispus, and the widow will nurse thee. Consider, old man, what I say, said Vinicius, who frowned still more. I owe thee gratitude, and thou seemest good and honest, but thou dost not tell me what thou hast in the bottom of thy soul. Thou art afraid lest I summon my slaves and command them to take Ligia. Is this true? It is, said Crispus, with sternness. Then remember this, I shall speak before all to Shiloh, and write a letter home that I have gone to Beneventum. I shall have no messengers hereafter but you. Remember this, and do not irritate me longer. Here he was indignant, and his face was contorted with anger. Afterward he began to speak excitedly, Hast thou thought that I would deny that I wished to stay here to see her? A fool would have divined that, even had I denied it. But I will not try to take her by force any longer. I will tell thee more, if she will not stay here, I will tear the bandages with this sound hand from my arm, will take neither food nor drink. Let my death fall on thee and thy brethren. Why hast thou nursed me? Why hast thou not commanded to kill me? He grew pale from weakness and anger. Lygia, who had heard all from the other room and who was certain that Vinicius would do what he promised, was terrified. She would not have him die for anything. Wounded and defenseless, he roused in her compassion, not fear. Living from the time of her flight among people in continual religious enthusiasm, thinking only of sacrifices, offerings, and boundless charity, she had grown so excited herself through that new inspiration, that for her it took the place of house, family, lost happiness, and made her one of those Christian maidens who, later on, changed the former soul of the world. Vinicius had been too important in her fate, had been thrust too much on her, to let her forget him. She had thought of him whole days, and more than once had begged God for the moment in which, following the inspiration of religion, she might return good for his evil, mercy for his persecution, break him, win him to Christ, save him. And now it seemed to her that precisely that moment had come, and that her prayers had been heard. She approached Crispus therefore with a face as if inspired, and addressed him as though some other voice spoke through her. Let him stay among us, Crispus, and we will stay with him till Christ gives him health. The old presbyter, accustomed to seek in all things the inspiration of God, beholding her exaltation, thought at once that perhaps a higher power was speaking through her, and, fearing in his heart, he bent his grey head, saying, Let it be as thou sayest. On Vinicius, who the whole time had not taken his eyes from her. This ready obedience of Crispus produced a wonderful and pervading impression. It seemed to him that among the Christians Lygia was a kind of sibyl or priestess whom they surrounded with obedience and honor, and he yielded himself also to that honor. To the love which he felt was joined now a certain awe, in presence of which love itself became something almost insolent. He could not familiarize himself, however, with the thought that their relations had changed, that now not she was dependent on his will, but he on hers, that he was lying there sick and broken, that he had ceased to be an attacking, a conquering force, that he was like a defenseless child in her care. For his proud and commanding nature such relations with any other person would have been humiliating. Now, however, not only did he not feel humiliated, but he was thankful to her as to his sovereign. In him those were feelings unheard of, feelings which he could not have entertained the day before, and which would have amazed him even on that day had he been able to analyze them clearly. But he did not inquire at the moment why it was so, just as if the position had been perfectly natural. He merely felt happy because he remained there, and he wished to thank her with gratefulness, and still with a kind of feeling unknown to him in such a degree that he knew not what to call it, for it was simply submission. His previous excitement had so exhausted him that he could not speak, and he thanked her only with his eyes, which were gleaming from delight because he remained near her, and would be able to see her tomorrow, next day, perhaps a long time. That delight was diminished only by the dread that he might lose what he had gained. So great was this dread that when Lygia gave him water a second time, and the wish seized him to take her hand, he feared to do so. He feared that Vinicius who at Caesar's feast had kissed her lips in spite of her. That Vinicius who after her flight had promised himself to drag her by the hair to the cubiculum, or give command to flog her. Chapter 24. But he began also to fear that some outside force might disturb his delight. Shiloh might give notice of his disappearance to the prefect of the city, or to his freedmen at home, and in such an event an invasion of the house by the city guards was likely. Through his head flew the thought, it is true, that in that event he might give command to seize Lygia and shut her up in his house, but he felt that he ought not to do so, and he was not capable of acting thus. He was tyrannical, insolent, and corrupt enough. If need be he was inexorable, but he was not Tigellinus or Nero. Military life had left in him a certain feeling of justice, and religion, and a conscience to understand that such a deed would be monstrously mean. He would have been capable, perhaps, of committing such a deed during an access of anger and while in possession of his strength, but at that moment he was filled with tenderness, and was sick. The only question for Vinicius at that time was that no one should stand between him and Lygia. He noticed, too, with astonishment, that from the moment when Lygia had taken his part, neither she herself nor Crispus asked from him any assurances, just as if they felt confident that, in case of need, some superhuman power would defend them. The young tribune, in whose head the distinction between things possible and impossible had grown involved and faint since the discourse of the apostle in Ostranium, was also not too far from supposing that that might take place. But considering things more soberly, he remembered what he had said of the Greek, and asked again that Shiloh be brought to him. Crispus agreed, and they decided to send Ursus. Vinicius, who in recent days, before his visit to Ostranium, had sent slaves frequently to Shiloh, though without result, indicated his lodgings accurately to the Lygian. Then writing a few words on the tablet, he said, turning to Crispus, I give a tablet, for this man is suspicious and cunning. Frequently when summoned by me, he gave directions to answer my people that he was not at home. He did so always when he had no good news for me, and feared my anger. If I find him, I will bring him, willing or unwilling, said Ursus. Then, taking his mantle, he went out hurriedly. To find anyone in Rome was not easy, even with the most accurate directions, but in those cases the instinct of a hunter rated Ursus, and also his great knowledge of the city. After a certain time, therefore, he found himself at Shiloh's lodgings. He did not recognize Shiloh, however. He had seen him but once in his life before, and moreover, in the night. Besides, that lofty and confident old man who had persuaded him to murder Glaucus was so unlike the Greek, bent double from terror, that no one could suppose the two to be one person. Shiloh, noticing that Ursus looked at him as a perfect stranger, recovered from his first fear. The sight of the tablet, with the writing of Vinicius, calmed him still more. At least the suspicion that he would take him into an ambush purposely did not trouble him. He thought, besides, that the Christians had not killed Vinicius, evidently because they had not dared to raise hands on so noted a person. And then Vinicius will protect me in case of need, thought he. Of course he does not send to deliver me to death. Summoning some courage, therefore, he said, "My good man, has not my friend the noble Vinicius sent a litter? My feet are swollen, I cannot walk so far." "He has not," answered Ursus, "we shall go on foot." "But if I refuse?" "Do not, for thou wilt have to go." "And I will go, but of my own will." "No one could force me, for I am a free man, and a friend of the prefect of the city. As a sage, I have also means to overcome others, and I know how to turn people into trees and wild beasts. But I will go, I will go. I will only put on a mantle somewhat warmer, and a hood, lest the slaves of that quarter might recognize me. They would stop me every moment to kiss my hands." He put on a new mantle then, and let down a broad Gallic hood, lest Ursus might recognize his features on coming into clearer light. "Where wilt thou take me?" asked he. "On the road to the Trans-Tiber." "I am not long in Rome, and I have never been there, but there too, of course, live men who love virtue." But Ursus, who was a simple man, and had heard Vinicius say that the Greek had been with him in Ostranium, and had seen him with Croton enter the house in which Ligia lived, stopped for a moment and said, "Speak no untruth, old man, for today thou wert with Vinicius in Ostranium and under our gate." "Ah," said Chilo, "then is your house in the Trans-Tiber?" "I have not been long in Rome, and know not how the different parts are named." "That is true, friend. I was under the gate, and implored Vinicius in the name of virtue not to enter." "I was in Ostranium, and dost thou know why?" "I am working for a certain time over the conversion of Vinicius, and wished him to hear the chief of the apostles. May the light penetrate his soul and thine. But thou art a Christian, and wishest truth to overcome falsehood." "That is true," answered Ursus, with humility. Courage returned to Chilo completely. "Vinicius is a powerful lord," said he, "and a friend of Caesar. He listens often yet to the whisperings of the evil spirit, but if even a hair should fall from his head, Caesar would take vengeance on all the Christians. A higher power is protecting us." "Surely, surely." "But what do ye intend to do with Vinicius?" inquired Chilo, with fresh alarm. "I know not. Christ commands mercy." "Thou hast answered excellently. Think of this always, or thou wilt fry in hell like a sausage in a frying pan." Ursus sighed, and Chilo thought that he could always do what he liked with that man, who was terrible at the moment of his first outburst. So, wishing to know what happened at the seizing of Lygia, he asked further, in the voice of a stern judge, "How did ye treat Croton? Speak, and do not prevaricate." Ursus sighed a second time. "Vinicius will tell thee." "That means that thou didst stab him with a knife, or kill him with a club." "I was without arms." The Greek could not resist amazement at the superhuman strength of the barbarian. "May Pluto, that is to say, may Christ pardon thee." They went on for some time in silence. Then Chilo said, "I will not betray thee, but have a care of the watches." "I fear Christ, not the watches." "And that is proper. There is no more grievous crime than murder." "I will pray for thee, but I know not if even my prayer can be effective, unless thou make a vow never to touch any one in life with a finger." "As it is, I have not killed purposely," answered Ursus. But Chilo, who desired to secure himself in every case, did not cease to condemn murder, and urge Ursus to make the vow. He inquired also about Vinicius, but the Lygian answered his inquiries unwillingly, repeating that from Vinicius himself he would hear what he needed. Speaking in this way, they passed at last the long road which separated the lodgings of the Greek from the Trans-Tiber, and found themselves before the house. Chilo's heart began to beat again unquietly. From dread it seemed to him that Ursus was beginning to look at him with a kind of greedy expression. "It is small consolation to me," said he to himself, "if he kills me unwillingly. I prefer in every case that paralysis should strike him, and with him all the Lygians, which do thou effect, O Zeus, if thou art able." Thus meditating, he wrapped himself more closely in his Gallic mantle, repeating that he feared the cold. Finally, when they had passed the entrance and the first court, and found themselves in the corridor leading to the garden of the little house, he halted suddenly and said, "Let me draw breath, or I shall not be able to speak with Vinicius and give him saving advice." He halted, for though he said to himself that no danger threatened, Still his legs trembled under him at the thought that he was among those mysterious people whom he had seen in Ostrianum. Meanwhile a hymn came to their ears from the little house. "What is that?" inquired Shiloh. "Thou sayest that thou art a Christian, and knowest not that among us it is the custom after every meal to glorify our Savior with singing," answered Ursus. "Miriam and her son must have returned, and perhaps the apostle is with them, for he visits the widow and Crispus every day. Conduct me directly to Vinicius." Vinicius is in the same room with all, for that is the only large one. The others are very small chambers, to which we go only to sleep. "Come in, thou wilt rest there." They entered. It was rather dark in the room, the evening was cloudy and cold, the flames of a few candles did not dispel the darkness altogether. Vinicius divined rather than recognized Shiloh in the hooded man. Shiloh, seeing the bed in the corner of the room, and on it Vinicius, moved toward him directly, not looking at the others, as if with the conviction that it would be safest near him. "Oh, Lord, why didst thou not listen to my counsels?" exclaimed he, putting his hands together. "Silence," said Vinicius, "and listen." Here he looked sharply into Shiloh's eyes, and spoke slowly with emphasis, as if wishing the Greek to understand every word of his as a command, and to keep it forever in memory. "Croton threw himself on me to kill and rob me, dost understand? I killed him then, and these people dressed the wounds which I received in the struggle." Shiloh understood in a moment that if Vinicius spoke in this way it must be in virtue of some agreement with the Christians, and in that case he wished people to believe him. He saw this, too, from his face, hence in one moment, without showing doubt or astonishment, he raised his eyes and exclaimed, "That was a faith-breaking ruffian." "But I warned thee, Lord, not to trust him." My teachings bounded from his head as do peas when thrown against a wall. In all Hades there are not torments enough for him. He who cannot be honest must be a rogue. What is more difficult than for a rogue to become honest? But to fall on his benefactor, a Lord so magnanimous, O gods! Here he remembered that he had represented himself to Ursus on the way as a Christian, and stopped. "Were it not for the cica, which I brought, he would have slain me," said Vinicius. "I bless the moment in which I advised thee to take a knife even." Vinicius turned an inquiring glance on the Greek, and asked, "What hast thou done today?" "How? What? Have I not told thee, Lord, that I made a vow for thy health?" "Nothing more? I was just preparing to visit thee, when this good man came and said that thou hadst sent for me. Here is a tablet. Thou wilt go with it to my house. Thou wilt find my freedman and give it to him. It is written on the tablet that I have gone to Beneventum. Thou wilt tell Demas from thyself that I went this morning, summoned by an urgent letter from Petronius." Here he repeated with emphasis, "I have gone to Beneventum. Dost understand? Thou hast gone, Lord. This morning I took leave of thee at the Porta Capena, and from the time of thy departure such sadness possesses me that if thy magnanimity will not soften it, I shall cry myself to death." Like the unhappy wife of Zethus, Edon turned into a nightingale, in grief for Idlos. Vinicius, though sick and accustomed to the Greek's suppleness, could not repress a smile. He was glad, moreover, that Shiloh understood in a flash, hence he said, "Therefore I will write that thy tears be wiped away." "Give me the candle." Shiloh, now pacified perfectly, rose, and, advancing a few steps toward the chimney, took one of the candles which was burning at the wall. But while he was doing this, the hood slipped from his head, and the light fell directly on his face. Glaucus sprang from his seat and, coming up quickly, stood before him. "Dost thou not recognize me, Cephas?" asked he. In his voice there was something so terrible that a shiver ran through all present. Shiloh raised the candle, and dropped it to the earth almost the same instant. Then he bent nearly double and began to groan. "I am not he, I am not he." "Mercy." Glaucus turned toward the faithful, and said, "This is the man who betrayed, who ruined me and my family." That history was known to all the Christians and to Vinicius, who had not guessed who that Glaucus was, for this reason only, that he fainted repeatedly from pain during the dressing of his wound, and had not heard his name. But for Ursus that short moment, with the words of Glaucus, was like a lightning flash in darkness. Recognizing Shiloh, he was at his side with one spring, and, seizing his arm, bent it back, exclaiming, "This is the man who persuaded me to kill Glaucus." "Mercy!" groaned Shiloh. "I will give you, O Lord!" exclaimed he, turning his head to Vinicius, Save me. I trusted in thee. Take my part. Thy litter I will deliver it. O Lord, Lord. But Vinicius, who looked with more indifference than anyone at what was passing, first because all the affairs of the Greek were more or less known to him, and second because his heart knew not what pity was, said, Bury him in the garden, someone else will take the letter. It seemed to Shiloh that those words were his final sentence. His bones were shaking in the terrible hands of Ursus, his eyes were filled with tears from pain. By your God, pity, cried he, I am a Christian. Pax vobiscum. I am a Christian, and if ye do not believe me, baptize me again, baptize me twice, 10 times. Glaucus, that is a mistake. Let me speak, make me a slave. Do not kill me. Have mercy. His voice, stifled with pain, was growing weaker and weaker, when the Apostle Peter rose at the table. For a moment his white head shook, drooping toward his breast, and his eyes were closed, but he opened them then, and said amid silence, The Savior said this to us, If thy brother has sinned against thee, chastise him, but if he is repentant, forgive him. And if he has offended 7 times in the day against thee, and has turned to thee 7 times, saying, Have mercy on me, forgive him. Then came a still deeper silence. Glaucus remained a long time with his hands covering his face. At last he removed them and said, Cephas, may God forgive thy offenses, as I forgive them in the name of Christ. Ursus, letting go the arms of the Greek, added at once, May the Savior be merciful to thee as I forgive thee. Shiloh dropped to the ground, and, supported on it with his hands, turned his head like a wild beast caught in a snare, looking around to see whence death might come. He did not trust his eyes and ears yet, and dared not hope for forgiveness. Consciousness returned to him slowly, his blue lips were still trembling from terror. Depart in peace, said the apostle. Meanwhile Shiloh rose, but could not speak. He approached the bed of Vinicius, as if seeking protection in it still, for he had not time yet to think that that man, though he had used his services and was still his accomplice, condemned him, while those against whom he had acted forgave. This thought was to come to him later. At present simply astonishment and incredulity were evident in his look. Though he had seen that they forgave him, he wished to bear away his head at the earliest from among these incomprehensible people, whose kindness terrified him almost as much as their cruelty would have terrified. It seemed to him that should he remain longer, something unexpected would happen again. Hence, standing above Vinicius, he said with a broken voice, Give the letter, Lord, give the letter. And snatching the tablet which Vinicius handed him, he made one obeisance to the Christians, another to the sick man, pushed along sidewise by the very wall, and hurried out through the door. In the garden, when darkness surrounded him, fear raised the hair on his head again, for he felt sure that Ursus would rush out and kill him in the night. He would have run with all his might, but his legs would not move. Next moment they were perfectly uncontrollable, for Ursus stood near him really. Shiloh fell with his face to the earth, and began to groan, Urban in Christ's name. But Urban said, Fear not. The apostle commanded me to lead thee out beyond the gate, lest thou might go astray in the darkness, and, if strength failed thee, to conduct thee home. What dost thou say? Asked Shiloh, raising his face. What? Thou wilt not kill me? No, I will not. And if I seized thee too roughly and harmed a bone in thee, pardon me, help me to rise, said the Greek. Thou wilt not kill me? Thou wilt not? Take me to the street, I will go farther alone. Ursus raised him as he might a feather, and placed him on his feet. Then he conducted him through the dark corridor to the second court. From there was a passage to the entrance and the street. In the corridor Shiloh repeated again in his soul, It is all over with me. Only when he found himself on the street did he recover and say, I can go on alone. Peace be with thee, and with thee, and with thee. Let me draw breath. And after Ursus had gone, he breathed with a full breast. He felt his waist and hips, as if to convince himself that he was living, and then moved forward with hurried step. But why did they not kill me? And in spite of all his talk with Eurystheus about Christian teaching, in spite of his conversation at the river with Urban, and in spite of all that he had heard in Ostrionum, he could find no answer to that question. Chapter 25. Neither could Vinicius discover the cause of what had happened, and in the bottom of his soul he was almost as much astonished as Shiloh, that those people should treat him as they had, and, instead of avenging his attack, dress his wounds carefully, he ascribed partly to the doctrine which they confessed, more to Lygia, and a little, also, to his great significance. But their conduct with Shiloh simply went beyond his understanding of man's power of forgiveness. And the question thrust itself into his mind: why did they not kill the Greek? They might have killed him with impunity. Ursus would have buried him in the garden, or borne him in the dark to the Tiber, which during that period of night murders, committed by Caesar himself even, cast up human bodies so frequently in the morning that no one inquired whence they came. To his thinking, the Christians had not only the power, but the right to kill Shiloh. True, pity was not entirely a stranger to that world to which the young patrician belonged. The Athenians raised an altar to pity, and opposed for a long time the introduction of gladiatorial combats into Athens. In Rome itself the conquered received pardon sometimes, as, for instance, Callicratus, king of the Britons, who, taken prisoner in the time of Claudius, and provided for by him bountifully, dwelt in the city in freedom. But vengeance for a personal wrong seemed to Vinicius, as to all, proper and justified. The neglect of it was entirely opposed to his spirit. True, he had heard in Austrian hymn that one should love even enemies, that, however, he considered as a kind of theory without application in life. And now this passed through his head, that perhaps they had not killed Shiloh because the day was among festivals, or was in some period of the moon during which it was not proper for Christians to kill a man. He had heard that there are days among various nations on which it is not permitted to begin war even. But why, in such a case, did they not deliver the Greek up to justice? Why did the apostle say that if a man offended 7 times, it was necessary to forgive him 7 times? And why did Glaucus say to Shiloh, "May God forgive thee, as I forgive thee"? Shiloh had done him the most terrible wrong that one man could do another. At the very thought of how he would act with a man who killed Ligia, for instance, the heart of Vinicius seethed up, as does water in a cauldron. There were no torments which he would not inflict in his vengeance. But Glaucus had forgiven. Ursus, too, had forgiven. Ursus, who might in fact kill whomever he wished in Rome with perfect impunity, for all he needed was to kill the king of the grove in Nemi, and take his place. Could the gladiator holding that office to which he had succeeded only by killing the previous king, resist the man whom Croton could not resist? There was only one answer to all these questions, that they refrained from killing him through a goodness so great that the like of it had not been in the world up to that time, and through an unbounded love of man, which commands to forget one's self, one's wrongs, one's happiness and misfortune, and live for others. What reward those people were to receive for this, Vinicius heard in Austrian hymn, but he could not understand it. He felt, however, that the earthly life connected with the duty of renouncing everything good and rich for the benefit of others must be wretched. So in what he thought of the Christians at that moment, besides the greatest astonishment, there was pity, and as it were a shade of contempt. It seemed to him that they were sheep which earlier or later must be eaten by wolves. His Roman nature could yield no recognition to people who let themselves be devoured. This one thing struck him, however, that after Shiloh's departure the faces of all were bright with a certain deep joy. The apostle approached Glaucus, placed his hand on his head, and said, "In thee Christ has triumphed." The other raised his eyes, which were full of hope, and as bright with joy as if some great unexpected happiness had been poured on him. Vinicius, who could understand only joy or delight born of vengeance, looked on him with eyes staring from fever, and somewhat as he would on a madman. He saw, however, and saw not without internal indignation, that Lygia pressed her lips of a queen to the hand of that man, who had the appearance of a slave. And it seemed to him that the order of the world was inverted utterly. Next Ursus told how he had conducted Shiloh to the street, and had asked forgiveness for the harm which he might have done his bones. For this the apostle blessed him also. Crispus declared that it was a day of great victory. Hearing of this victory, Vinicius lost the thread of his thought altogether. But when Lygia gave him a cooling draught again, he held her hand for a moment, and asked, "Then must thou also forgive me?" "We are Christians. It is not permitted us to keep anger in the heart." "Lygia," said he, "whoever thy God is, I honor him only because he is thine." "Thou wilt honor him in thy heart when thou lovest him." "Only because he is thine," repeated Vinicius, in a fainter voice, and he closed his eyes, for weakness had mastered him again. Lygia went out, but returned after a time, and bent over him to learn if he were sleeping. Vinicius, feeling that she was near, opened his eyes and smiled. She placed her hand over them lightly, as if to incline him to slumber. A great sweetness seized him then, but soon he felt more grievously ill than before, and was very ill in reality. Night had come, and with it a more violent fever. He could not sleep, and followed Lygia with his eyes wherever she went. At times he fell into a kind of doze, in which he saw and heard everything which happened around him, but in which reality was mingled with feverish dreams. It seemed to him that in some old, deserted cemetery stood a temple, in the form of a tower, in which Lygia was priestess. He did not take his eyes from her, but saw her on the summit of the tower, with a lute in her hands, all in the light, like those priestesses who in the night-time sing hymns in honor of the moon, and whom he had seen in the Orient. He himself was climbing up winding steps, with great effort, to bear her away with him. Behind was creeping up Shiloh, with teeth chattering from terror, and repeating, "Do not do that, Lord, she is a priestess, for whom he will take vengeance." Vinicius did not know who that he was, but he understood that he himself was going to commit some sacrilege, and he felt a boundless fear also. But when he went to the balustrade surrounding the summit of the tower, the apostle with his silvery beard stood at Lygia's side on a sudden, and said, "Do not raise a hand, she belongs to me." Then he moved forward with her, on a path formed by rays from the moon, as if on a path made to heaven. He stretched his hands toward them, and begged both to take him into their company. Here he woke, became conscious, and looked before him. The lamp on the tall staff shone more dimly, but still cast a light sufficiently clear. All were sitting in front of the fire warming themselves, for the night was chilly, and the chamber rather cold. Vinicius saw the breath coming as steam from their lips. In the midst of them sat the apostle. At his knees, on a low footstool, was Lygia, farther on, Glaucus, Crispus, Miriam, and at the edge, on one side Ursus, on the other Miriam's son Nazarius, a youth with a handsome face, and long, dark hair reaching down to his shoulders. Lygia listened with eyes raised to the apostle, and every head was turned toward him, while he told something in an undertone. Vinicius gazed at Peter with a certain superstitious awe, hardly inferior to that terror which he felt during the fever dream. The thought passed through his mind that that dream had touched truth, that the gray-haired man there, freshly come from distant shores, would take Lygia from him really, and take her somewhere away by unknown paths. He felt sure also that the old man was speaking of him, perhaps telling how to separate him from Lygia, for it seemed to him impossible that anyone could speak of aught else. Hence, collecting all his presence of mind, he listened to Peter's words. But he was mistaken altogether, for the apostle was speaking of Christ again. They live only through that name, thought Vinicius. The old man was describing the seizure of Christ. A company came, and servants of the priest to seize him. When the Savior asked whom they were seeking, they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." But when he said to them, "I am he," they fell on the ground, and dared not raise a hand on him. Only after the second inquiry did they seize him. Here the apostle stopped, stretched his hands toward the fire and continued, "The night was cold, like this one, but the heart in me was seething, so, drawing the sword to defend him, I cut an ear from the servant of the high priest. I would have defended him more than my own life had he not said to me, 'Put thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father has given me, shall I not drink it?'" Then they seized and bound him. When he had spoken thus far, Peter placed his palm on his forehead, and was silent, wishing before he went further to stop the crowd of his recollections. But Ursus, unable to restrain himself, sprang to his feet, trimmed the light on the staff till the sparks scattered in golden rain and the flame shot up with more vigor. Then he sat down, and exclaimed, "No matter what happened." He stopped suddenly, for Lygia had put her finger to her lips. But he breathed loudly, and it was clear that a storm was in his soul, and though he was ready at all times to kiss the feet of the apostle, that act was one he could not accept. If someone in his presence had raised hands on the Redeemer, if he had been with him on that night, splinters would have shot from the soldiers, the servants of the priest, and the officials. Tears came to his eyes at the very thought of this, and because of his sorrow and mental struggle, for on the one hand he thought that he would not only have defended the Redeemer, but would have called Lygians to his aid, splendid fellows, and on the other, if he had acted thus he would have disobeyed the Redeemer, and hindered the salvation of man. For this reason he could not keep back his tears. After a while Peter took his palm from his forehead, and resumed the narrative. But Vinicius was overpowered by a new feverish, waking dream. What he heard now was in his mind mixed up with what the apostle had told the night previous in Ostranium, of that day in which Christ appeared on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias. He saw a sheet of water broadly spread out, on it the boat of a fisherman, and in the boat Peter and Lygia. He himself was moving with all his might after that boat, but pain in his broken arm prevented him from reaching it. The wind hurled waves in his eyes, he began to sink, and called with entreating voice for rescue. Lygia knelt down then before the apostle, who turned his boat, and reached an oar, which Vinicius seized. With their assistance he entered the boat and fell on the bottom of it. It seemed to him, then, that he stood up, and saw a multitude of people sailing after them. Waves covered their heads with foam. In the whirl only the hands of a few could be seen, but Peter saved the drowning time after time, and gathered them into his boat, which grew larger, as if by a miracle. Soon crowds filled it, as numerous as those which were collected in Ostranium, and then still greater crowds. Vinicius wondered how they could find place there, and he was afraid that they would sink to the bottom. But Lygia pacified him by showing him light on the distant shore toward which they were sailing. These dream pictures of Vinicius were blended again with descriptions which he had heard in Ostranium, from the lips of the apostle, as to how Christ had appeared on the lake once. So that he saw now in that light on the shore a certain form toward which Peter was steering, and as he approached it the weather grew calmer, the water grew smoother, the light became greater. The crowd began to sing sweet hymns, the air was filled with the odor of nard, the play of water formed a rainbow, as if from the bottom of the lake lilies and roses were looking, and at last the boat struck its breast safely against the sand. Lygia took his hand then, and said, "Come, I will lead thee." And she led him to the light. Vinicius woke again, but his dreaming ceased slowly, and he did not recover at once the sense of reality. It seemed for a time to him that he was still on the lake, and surrounded by crowds, among which, not knowing the reason himself, he began to look for Petronius, and was astonished not to find him. The bright light from the chimney, at which there was no one at that time, brought him completely to his senses. Olive sticks were burning slowly under the rosy ashes, but the splinters of pine, which evidently had been put there some moments before, shot up a bright flame, and in the light of this, Vinicius saw Lygia, sitting not far from his bedside. The sight of her touched him to the depth of his soul. He remembered that she had spent the night before in Ostranium, and had busied herself the whole day in nursing him, and now when all had gone to rest, she was the only one watching. It was easy to divine that she must be wearied, for while sitting motionless her eyes were closed. Vinicius knew not whether she was sleeping or sunk in thought. He looked at her profile, at her drooping lashes, at her hands lying on her knees, and in his pagan head the idea began to hatch with difficulty that at the sight of naked beauty, confident, and proud of Greek and Roman symmetry, there is another in the world, new, immensely pure, in which a soul has its dwelling. He could not bring himself so far as to call it Christian, but, thinking of Lygia, he could not separate her from the religion which she confessed. He understood, even, that if all the others had gone to rest, and she alone were watching, she whom he had injured, it was because her religion commanded her to watch. But that thought, which filled him with wonder for the religion, was disagreeable to him. He would rather that Lygia acted thus out of love for him. His face, his eyes, his statuesque form, in a word for reasons because of which more than once snow-white Grecian and Roman arms had been wound around his neck. Still he felt all at once, that, were she like other women, something would be lacking in her. He was amazed, and knew not what was happening in him, for he saw that new feelings of some kind were rising in him, new likings, strange to the world in which he had lived hitherto. She opened her eyes then, and, seeing that Vinicius was gazing at her, she approached him and said, "I am with thee." "I saw thy soul in a dream," replied he. Chapter 26. Next morning he woke up weak, but with a cool head and free of fever. It seemed to him that a whispered conversation had roused him, but when he opened his eyes, Lygia was not there. Ursus, stooping before the chimney, was raking apart the grey ashes, and seeking live coals beneath them. When he found some, he began to blow, not with his mouth, but as it were with the bellows of a blacksmith. Vinicius, remembering how that man had crushed Croton the day before, examined with attention befitting a lover of the arena his gigantic back, which resembled the back of a cyclops, and his limbs strong as columns. Thanks to Mercury that my neck was not broken by him, thought Vinicius. By Pollux, if the other legions are like this one, the Danubian legions will have heavy work some time. But aloud he said, "Hey, slave." Ursus drew his head out of the chimney, and, smiling in a manner almost friendly, said, "God give thee a good day, Lord, and good health, but I am a free man, not a slave." On Vinicius, who wished to question Ursus touching Lygia's birthplace, these words produced a certain pleasant impression, for discourse with a free though a common man was less disagreeable to his Roman and patrician pride, than with a slave, in whom neither law nor custom recognized human nature. "Then thou dost not belong to Alice?" asked he. "No, Lord, I serve Galena, as I served her mother, of my own will." Here he hid his head again in the chimney, to blow the coals, on which he had placed some wood. When he had finished, he took it out and said, "With us there are no slaves." "Where is Ligia?" inquired Vinicius. "She has gone out, and I am to cook food for thee." "She watched over thee the whole night." "Why didst thou not relieve her?" "Because she wished to watch, and it is for me to obey." Here his eyes grew gloomy, and after a while he added, "If I had disobeyed her, thou wouldst not be living." "Art thou sorry for not having killed me?" "No, Lord. Christ has not commanded us to kill." "But Attisnus and Croton?" "I could not do otherwise," muttered Ursus. And he looked with regret on his hands, which had remained pagan evidently, though his soul had accepted the cross. Then he put a pot on the crane, and fixed his thoughtful eyes on the fire. "That was thy fault, Lord," said he at last. "Why didst thou raise thy hand against her, a king's daughter?" Pride boiled up, at the first moment, in Vinicius, because a common man and a barbarian had not merely dared to speak to him thus familiarly, but to blame him in addition to those uncommon and improbable things which had met him since yesterday, was added another. But being weak and without his slaves, he restrained himself, especially since a wish to learn some details of Lygia's life gained the upper hand in him. When he had calmed himself, therefore, he inquired about the war of the Lygians against Vannius and the Suevi. Ursus was glad to converse, but could not add much that was new to what in his time Aulus Plautius had told. Ursus had not been in battle, for he had attended the hostages to the camp of Aetolius Hister. He knew only that the Lygians had beaten the Suevi and the Iazygi, but that their leader and king had fallen from the arrows of the Iazygi. Immediately after they received news that the Semnones had set fire to forests on their boundaries, they returned in haste to avenge the wrong, and the hostages remained with Aetolius, who ordered at first to give them kingly honors. Afterward Lygia's mother died. The Roman commander knew not what to do with the child. Ursus wished to return with her to their own country, but the road was unsafe because of wild beasts and wild tribes. When news came that an embassy of Lygians had visited Pomponius, offering him aid against the Marcomanni, Hister sent him with Lygia to Pomponius. When they came to him they learned, however, that no ambassadors had been there, and in that way they remained in the camp, whence Pomponius took them to Rome, and at the conclusion of his triumph he gave the king's daughter to Pomponia Graecina. Though only certain small details of this narrative had been unknown to Vinicius, he listened with pleasure, for his enormous pride of family was pleased that an eyewitness had confirmed Lygia's royal descent. As a king's daughter she might occupy a position at Caesar's court equal to the daughters of the very first families, all the more since the nation whose ruler her father had been, had not warred with Rome so far, and, though barbarian, it might become terrible, for, according to Aetolius Hister himself, it possessed an immense force of warriors. Ursus, moreover, confirmed this completely. "We live in the woods," said he, in answer to Vinicius, "but we have so much land that no man knows where the end is, and there are many people on it. There are also wooden towns in the forest, in which there is great plenty, for what the Semnones, the Marcomanni, the Vandals, and the Quadi plunder through the world, we take from them. They dare not come to us, but when the wind blows from their side, they burn our forests. We fear neither them nor the Roman Caesar." "The gods gave Rome dominion over the earth," said Vinicius severely. "The gods are evil spirits," replied Ursus, with simplicity, "and where there are no Romans, There is no supremacy. Here he fixed the fire, and said, as if to himself, when Caesar took Helena to the palace, and I thought that harm might meet her, I wanted to go to the forest and bring Lygians to help the king's daughter. And Lygians would have moved toward the Danube, for they are virtuous people though pagan. There I should have given them good tidings. But as it is, if ever Helena returns to Pomponia Graecina, I will bow down to her for permission to go to them, for Christus was born far away, and they have not even heard of him. He knew better than I where he should be born, but if he had come to the world with us, in the forests, we would not have tortured him to death, that is certain. We would have taken care of the child, and guarded him, so that never should he want for game, mushrooms, beaver skins, or amber. And what we plundered from the Suevi and the Marcomanni we would have given him, so that he might have comfort and plenty. Thus speaking, he put near the fire the vessel with food for Vinicius, and was silent. His thoughts wandered evidently, for a time yet, through the Lygian wildernesses, till the liquid began to boil. Then he poured it into a shallow plate, and, cooling it properly, said, Glaucus advises thee, Lord, to move even thy sound arm as little as possible. Helena has commanded me to give thee food. Lygia commanded. There was no answer to that. It did not even come to Vinicius's head to oppose her will, just as if she had been the daughter of Caesar or a goddess. He uttered not a word, therefore, and Ursus, sitting near his bed, took out the liquid with a small cup, and put it to his mouth. He did this so carefully, and with such a kindly smile, that Vinicius could not believe his own eyes, could not think him the same terrible Titan who the day before had crushed Croton, and, rushing on him like a storm, would have torn him to pieces but for Lygia's pity. The young patrician, for the first time in life, began to ponder over this, what can take place in the breast of a simple man, a barbarian, and a servant. But Ursus proved to be a nurse as awkward as painstaking. The cup was lost among his Herculean fingers so completely that there was no place left for the mouth of the sick man. After a few fruitless efforts the giant was troubled greatly, and said, it would be easier to lead an aurochs out of a snare. The anxiety of the Lygian amused Vinicius, but his remark did not interest him less. He had seen in circuses the terrible urus, brought from wildernesses of the north, against which the most daring bestiarii went with dread, and which yielded only to elephants in size and strength. Hast thou tried to take such beasts by the horns? Inquired he, with astonishment. Till the 20th winter passed over me, I was afraid, answered Ursus, but after that it happened. And he began to feed Vinicius still more awkwardly than before. I must ask Miriam or Nazarius, said he. But now Lygia's pale face appeared from behind the curtain. I will assist directly, said she. And after a while she came from the cubiculum, in which she had been preparing to sleep, as it seemed, for she was in a single close tunic, called by the ancients capitium, covering the breast completely, and her hair was unbound. Vinicius, whose heart beat with more quickness at sight of her, began to upbraid her for not thinking of sleep yet, but she answered joyously, I was just preparing to sleep, but first I will take the place of Ursus. She took the cup, and, sitting on the edge of the bed, began to give food to Vinicius, who felt at once overcome and delighted. When she inclined toward him, the warmth of her body struck him, and her unbound hair fell on his breast. He grew pale from the impression, but in the confusion and impulse of desires he felt also that that was a head dear above all and magnified above all, in comparison with which the whole world was nothing. At first he had desired her, now he began to love her with a full breast. Before that, as generally in life and in feeling, he had been, like all people of that time, a blind, unconditional egotist, who thought only of himself. At present he began to think of her. After a while, therefore, he refused further nourishment, and though he found inexhaustible delight in her presence and in looking at her, he said, Enough. Go to rest, my divine one. Do not address me in that way, answered Lygia. It is not proper for me to hear such words. She smiled at him, however, and said that sleep had fled from her, that she felt no toil, that she would not go to rest till Glaucus came. He listened to her words as to music, his heart rose with increasing delight, increasing gratitude, and his thought was struggling to show her that gratitude. Lygia, said he, after a moment of silence, I did not know thee hitherto, but I know now that I wished to attain thee by a false way. Hence I say, return to Pomponia Graecina, and be assured that in future no hand will be raised against thee." Her face became sad on a sudden. "I should be happy," answered she, "could I look at her, even from a distance, but I cannot return to her now." "Why?" inquired Vinicius, with astonishment. "We Christians know, through Octe, what is done on the Palatine. Hast thou not heard that Caesar, soon after my flight and before his departure for Naples, summoned Alice and Pomponia, and, thinking that they had helped me, threatened them with his anger?" Fortunately Alice was able to say to him, "Thou knowest, Lord, that a lie has never passed my lips. I swear to thee now that we did not help her to escape, and we do not know, as thou dost not, what has happened to her." Caesar believed, and afterward forgot. "By the advice of the elders I have never written to mother where I am, so that she might take an oath boldly at all times that she has no knowledge of me. Thou wilt not understand this, perhaps, O Vinicius, but it is not permitted us to lie, even in a question involving life. Such is the religion on which we fashion our hearts. Therefore I have not seen Pomponia from the hour when I left her house. From time to time distant echoes barely reach her that I am alive and not in danger." Here a longing seized Lygia, and her eyes were moist with tears, but she calmed herself quickly, and said, "I know that Pomponia, too, yearns for me, but we have consolation which others have not." "Yes," answered Vinicius, "Christ is your consolation, but I do not understand that. Look at us. For us there are no partings, no pains, no sufferings, or if they come they are turned into pleasure. And death itself, which for you is the end of life, is for us merely its beginning, the exchange of a lower for a higher happiness, a happiness less calm for one calmer and eternal. Consider what must a religion be which enjoins on us love even for our enemies, forbids falsehood, purifies our souls from hatred, and promises happiness inexhaustible after death. I heard those teachings in Ostrianum, and I have seen how ye acted with me and with Shiloh. When I remember your deeds, they are like a dream, and it seems to me that I ought not to believe my ears or eyes. But answer me this question, art thou happy?" "I am," answered Lygia. "One who confesses Christ cannot be unhappy." Vinicius looked at her, as though what she said passed every measure of human understanding. "And hast thou no wish to return to Pomponia?" "I should like, from my whole soul, to return to her, and shall return, if such be God's will. I say to thee, therefore, return, and I swear by my Lares that I will not raise a hand against thee." Lygia thought for a moment, and answered, "No, I cannot expose those near me to danger. Caesar does not like the Plautiuses. Should I return, thou knowest how every news is spread throughout Rome by slaves. My return would be noised about in the city. Nero would hear of it surely through his slaves, and punish Alice and Pomponia, at least take me from them a second time." "True," answered Vinicius, frowning, "that would be possible. He would do so, even to show that his will must be obeyed. It is true that he only forgot thee, or would remember thee, because the loss was not his, but mine. Perhaps, if he took thee from Alice and Pomponia, he would send thee to me and I could give thee back to them." "Vinicius, wouldst thou see me again on the Palatine?" inquired Lygia. He set his teeth, and answered, "No." "Thou art right." I spoke like a fool. "No." And all at once he saw before him a precipice, as it were without bottom. He was a patrician, a military tribune, a powerful man, but above every power of that world to which he belonged was a madman whose will and malignity it was impossible to foresee. Only such people as the Christians might cease to reckon with Nero or fear him, people for whom this whole world, with its separations and sufferings, was as nothing, people for whom death itself was as nothing. All others had to tremble before him. The terrors of the time in which they lived showed themselves to Vinicius in all their monstrous extent. He could not return Lygia to Alice and Pomponia, then, through fear that the monster would remember her, and turn on her his anger. For the very same reason, if he should take her as wife, he might expose her, himself, and Alice. A moment of ill humor was enough to ruin all. Vinicius felt, for the first time in life, that either the world must change and be transformed, or life would become impossible altogether. He understood also this, which a moment before had been dark to him, that in such times only Christians could be happy. But above all, sorrow seized him, for he understood, too, that it was he who had so involved his own life and Lygia's that out of the complication there was scarcely an outcome. and under the influence of that sorrow he began to speak. Dost thou know that thou art happier than I? Thou art in poverty, and in this one chamber, among simple people. Thou hast thy religion and thy Christ, but I have only thee, and when I lacked thee I was like a beggar without a roof above him and without bread. Thou art dearer to me than the whole world. I sought thee, for I could not live without thee. I wished neither feasts nor sleep. Had it not been for the hope of finding thee, I should have cast myself on a sword. But I fear death, for if dead I could not see thee. I speak the pure truth in saying that I shall not be able to live without thee. I have lived so far only in the hope of finding and beholding thee. Dost thou remember our conversations at the house of Alice? Once thou didst draw a fish for me on the sand, and I knew not what its meaning was. Dost thou remember how we played ball? I loved thee then above life, and thou hadst begun already to divine that I loved thee. Alice came, frightened us with Libitina, and interrupted our talk. Pomponia, at parting, told Petronius that God is one, almighty and all-merciful, but it did not even occur to us that Christ was thy God and hers. Let him give thee to me and I will love him, though he seems to me a God of slaves, foreigners, and beggars. Thou sittest near me, and thinkest of him only. Think of me too, or I shall hate him. For me thou alone art a divinity. Blessed be thy father and mother, blessed the land which produced thee. I should wish to embrace thy feet and pray to thee, give thee honor, homage, offerings, thou thrice divine. Thou knowest not, or canst not know, how I love thee. Thus speaking, he placed his hand on his pale forehead and closed his eyes. His nature never knew bounds in love or anger. He spoke with enthusiasm, like a man who, having lost self-control, has no wish to observe any measure in words or feelings. But he spoke from the depth of his soul, and sincerely. It was to be felt that the pain, ecstasy, desire, and homage accumulated in his breast had burst forth at last in an irresistible torrent of words. To Lygia his words appeared blasphemous, but still her heart began to beat as if it would tear the tunic enclosing her bosom. She could not resist pity for him and his suffering. She was moved by the homage with which he spoke to her. She felt beloved and deified without bounds. She felt that that unbending and dangerous man belonged to her now, soul and body, like a slave, and that feeling of his submission in her own power filled her with happiness. Her recollections revived in one moment. He was for her again that splendid Vinicius, beautiful as a pagan god, he, who in the house of Alice had spoken to her of love, and roused as if from sleep her heart half childlike at that time, he from whose embraces Ursus had wrested her on the Palatine, as he might have wrested her from flames. But at present, with ecstasy, and at the same time with pain in his eagle face, with pale forehead and imploring eyes, wounded, broken by love, loving, full of homage and submissive, he seemed to her such as she would have wished him, and such as she would have loved with her whole soul, therefore dearer than he had ever been before. All at once she understood that a moment might come in which his love would seize her and bear her away, as a whirlwind, and when she felt this, she had the same impression that he had a moment before, that she was standing on the edge of a precipice. Was it for this that she had left the house of Alice? Was it for this that she had saved herself by flight? Was it for this that she had hidden so long in wretched parts of the city? Who was that Vinicius? An Augustine, a soldier, a courtier of Nero. Moreover, he took part in his profligacy and madness, as was shown by that feast, which she could not forget, and he went with others to the temples, and made offerings to vile gods, in whom he did not believe, perhaps, but still he gave them official honor. Still more he had pursued her to make her his slave and mistress, and at the same time to thrust her into that terrible world of excess, luxury, crime, and dishonor which calls for the anger and vengeance of God. He seemed changed, it is true, but still he had just said to her that if she would think more of Christ than of him, he was ready to hate Christ. It seemed to Lygia that the very idea of any other love than the love of Christ was a sin against him and against religion. When she saw then that other feelings and desires might be roused in the depth of her soul, she was seized by alarm for her own future in her own heart. At this moment of internal struggle appeared Glaucus, who had come to care for the patient and study his health. In the twinkle of an eye, anger and impatience were reflected on the face of Vinicius. He was angry that his conversation with Lygia had been interrupted, and when Glaucus questioned him, he answered with contempt almost. It is true that he moderated himself quickly, but if Lygia had any illusions as to this, that what he had heard in Austrian might have acted on his unyielding nature. Those illusions must vanish. He had changed only for her, but beyond that single feeling there remained in his breast the former harsh and selfish heart, truly Roman and wolfish, incapable not only of the sweet sentiment of Christian teaching but even of gratitude. She went away at last filled with internal care and anxiety. Formerly in her prayers she had offered to Christ a heart calm, and really pure as a tear. Now that calmness was disturbed. To the interior of the flower a poisonous insect had come and began to buzz. Even sleep, in spite of the 2 nights passed without sleep, brought her no relief. She dreamed that at Time Nero, at the head of a whole band of Augustines, Bacchans, Corybantes, and gladiators, was trampling crowds of Christians with his chariot wreathed in roses, and Vinicius seized her by the arm, drew her to the quadriga, and, pressing her to his bosom, whispered, "Come with us." Chapter 27. From that moment Lygia showed herself more rarely in the common chamber, and approached his couch less frequently. But peace did not return to her. She saw that Vinicius followed her with imploring glance, that he was waiting for every word of hers, as for a favor, that he suffered and dared not complain, lest he might turn her away from him, that she alone was his health and delight. And then her heart swelled with compassion. Soon she observed, too, that the more she tried to avoid him, the more compassion she had for him, and by this itself the more tender were the feelings which rose in her. Peace left her. At times she said to herself that it was her special duty to be near him always, first, because the religion of God commands return of good for evil, second, that by conversing with him, she might attract him to the faith. But at the same time conscience told her that she was tempting herself, that only love for him and the charm which he exerted were attracting her, nothing else. Thus she lived in a ceaseless struggle, which was intensified daily. At times it seemed that a kind of net surrounded her, and that in trying to break through it she entangled herself more and more. She had also to confess that for her the sight of him was becoming more needful, his voice was becoming dearer, and that she had to struggle with all her might against the wish to sit at his bedside. When she approached him, and he grew radiant, delight filled her heart. On a certain day she noticed traces of tears on his eyelids, and for the first time in life the thought came to her, to dry them with kisses. Terrified by that thought, and full of self-contempt, she wept all the night following. He was as enduring as if he had made a vow of patience. When at moments his eyes flashed with petulance, self-will, and anger, he restrained those flashes promptly, and looked with alarm at her, as if to implore pardon. This acted still more on her. Never had she such a feeling of being greatly loved as then, and when she thought of this, she felt at once guilty and happy. Vinicius, too, had changed essentially. In his conversations with Glaucus there was less pride. It occurred to him frequently that even that poor slave physician and that foreign woman, old Miriam, who surrounded him with attention, and Crispus, whom he saw absorbed in continual prayer, were still human. He was astonished at such thoughts, but he had them. After a time he conceived a liking for Ursus, with whom he conversed entire days, for with him he could talk about Ligia. The giant, on his part, was inexhaustible in narrative, and while performing the most simple services for the sick man, he began to show him also some attachment. For Vinicius, Lygia had been at all times a being of another order, higher 100 times than those around her. Nevertheless, he began to observe simple and poor people, a thing which he had never done before, and he discovered in them various traits the existence of which he had never suspected. Nazarius, however, he could not endure, for it seemed to him that the young lad had dared to fall in love with Lygia. He had restrained his aversion for a long time, it is true, but once when he brought her 2 quails, which he had bought in the market with his own earned money, the descendant of the Quirites spoke out in Vinicius, for whom one who had wandered in from a strange people had less worth than the meanest worm. When he heard Lygia's thanks, he grew terribly pale, and when Nazarius went out to get water for the birds, he said, "Lygia, canst thou endure that he should give thee gifts? Dost thou not know that the Greeks call people of his nation Jewish dogs? I do not know what the Greeks call them, but I know that Nazarius is a Christian and my brother." When she had said this she looked at Vinicius with astonishment and regret, for he had disaccustomed her to similar outbursts, and he set his teeth, so as not to tell her that he would have given command to beat such a brother with sticks, or would have sent him as a Compaditis, a man who labors with chained feet, to dig earth in his Sicilian vineyards. He restrained himself, however, throttled the anger within him, and only after a while did he say, "Pardon me, Lygia, for me thou art the daughter of a king and the adopted child of Plautius." And he subdued himself to that degree that when Nazarius appeared in the chamber again, he promised him, on returning to his villa, the gift of a pair of peacocks or flamingos, of which he had a garden full. Lygia understood what such victories over himself must have cost him, but the oftener he gained them the more her heart turned to him. His merit with regard to Nazarius was less, however, than she supposed. Vinicius might be indignant for a moment, but he could not be jealous of him. In fact, the sons of Miriam did not, in his eyes, mean much more than a dog. Besides, he was a child yet, who, if he loved Lygia, loved her unconsciously and servilely. Greater struggles must the young tribune have with himself to submit, even in silence, to that honor with which among those people the name of Christ and his religion was surrounded. In this regard wonderful things took place in Vinicius. That was in every case a religion which Lygia believed, hence for that single reason he was ready to receive it. Afterward, the more he returned to health, the more he remembered the whole series of events which had happened since that night at Ostranium, and the whole series of thoughts which had come to his head from that time, the more he was astonished at the superhuman power of that religion which changed the souls of men to their foundations. He understood that in it there was something uncommon, something which had not been on earth before, and he felt that could it embrace the whole world, could it engraft on the world its love and charity, an epoch would come recalling that in which not Jupiter, but Saturn had ruled. He did not dare either to doubt the supernatural origin of Christ, or his resurrection, or the other miracles. The eyewitnesses who spoke of them were too trustworthy and despised falsehood too much to let him suppose that they were telling things that had not happened. Finally, Roman skepticism permitted disbelief in the gods, but believed in miracles. Vinicius, therefore, stood before a kind of marvelous puzzle which he could not solve. On the other hand, however, that religion seemed to him opposed to the existing state of things, impossible of practice, and mad in a degree beyond all others. According to him, people in Rome and in the whole world might be bad, but the order of things was good. Had Caesar, for example, been an honest man, had the Senate been composed, not of insignificant libertines, but of men like Thrisi, what more could one wish? Nay, Roman peace and supremacy were good, distinction among people just and proper. But that religion, according to the understanding of Vinicius, would destroy all order, all supremacy, every distinction. What would happen then to the dominion and lordship of Rome? Could the Romans cease to rule, or could they recognize a whole herd of conquered nations as equal to themselves? That was a thought which could find no place in the head of a patrician. As regarded him personally, that religion was opposed to all his ideas and habits, his whole character and understanding of life. He was simply unable to imagine how he could exist were he to accept it. He feared and admired it, but as to accepting it, his nature shuddered at that. He understood, finally, that nothing save that religion separated him from Lygia, and when he thought of this, he hated it with all the powers of his soul. Still he acknowledged to himself that it had adorned Lygia with that exceptional, unexplained beauty which in his heart had produced, besides love, respect, besides desire, homage, and had made of that same Lygia a being dear to him beyond all others in the world. And then he wished anew to love Christ. And he understood clearly that he must either love or hate him. He could not remain indifferent. Meanwhile two opposing currents were as if driving him. He hesitated in thoughts, in feelings. He knew not how to choose. He bowed his head, however, to that God by him uncomprehended, and paid silent honor for this sole reason, that he was Lygia's God. Lygia saw what was happening in him. She saw how he was breaking himself, how his nature was rejecting that religion, and though this mortified her to the death, compassion, pity, and gratitude for the silent respect which he showed Christ inclined her heart to him with irresistible force. She recalled Pomponia Graecina and Alice. For Pomponia a source of ceaseless sorrow and tears that never dried was the thought that beyond the grave she would not find Alice. Lygia began now to understand better that pain, that bitterness. She too had found a being dear to her, and she was threatened by eternal separation from this dear one. At times, it is true, she was self-deceived, thinking that his soul would open itself to Christ's teaching, But these illusions could not remain. She knew and understood him too well. Vinicius a Christian. These two ideas could find no place together in her unenlightened head. If the thoughtful, discreet Alice had not become a Christian under the influence of the wise and perfect Pomponia, how could Vinicius become one? To this there was no answer, or rather there was only one, that for him there was neither hope nor salvation. But Lygia saw with terror that that sentence of condemnation which hung over him instead of making him repulsive made him still dearer simply through compassion. At moments the wish seized her to speak to him of his dark future, but once, when she had sat near him and told him that outside Christian truth there was no life, he, having grown stronger at that time, rose on his sound arm and placed his head on her knees. Suddenly, "Thou'rt life," said he. And that moment breath failed in her breast, presence of mind left her, a certain quiver of ecstasy rushed over her from head to feet. Seizing his temples with her hands, she tried to raise him, but bent the while so that her lips touched his hair, and for a moment both were overcome with delight, with themselves, and with love, which urged them the one to the other. Lygia rose at last and rushed away, with a flame in her veins and a giddiness in her head, but that was the drop which overflowed the cup filled already to the brim. Vinicius did not divine how dearly he would have to pay for that happy moment, but Lygia understood that now she herself needed rescue. She spent the night after that evening without sleep, in tears and in prayer, with the feeling that she was unworthy to pray and could not be heard. Next morning she went from the cubiculum early, and, calling Crispus to the garden summer house, covered with ivy and withered vines, opened her whole soul to him, imploring him at the same time to let her leave Miriam's house, since she could not trust herself longer, and could not overcome her heart's love for Vinicius. Crispus, an old man, severe and absorbed in endless enthusiasm, consented to the plan of leaving Miriam's house, but he had no words of forgiveness for that love, to his thinking sinful. His heart swelled with indignation at the very thought that Lygia, whom he had guarded since the time of her flight, whom he had loved, whom he had confirmed in the faith, and on whom he looked now as a white lily grown up on the field of Christian teaching undefiled by any earthly breath, could have found a place in her soul for love other than heavenly. He had believed hitherto that nowhere in the world did there beat a heart more purely devoted to the glory of Christ. He wanted to offer her to him as a pearl, a jewel, the precious work of his own hands. Hence the disappointment which he felt filled him with grief and amazement. "Go and beg God to forgive thy fault," said he, gloomily. "Flee before the evil spirit who involved thee bring thee to utter fall, and before thou oppose the Savior. God died on the cross to redeem thy soul with his blood, but thou hast preferred to love him who wished to make thee his concubine. God saved thee by a miracle of his own hands, but thou hast opened thy heart to impure desire, and hast loved the son of darkness. Who is he? The friend and servant of Antichrist, his co-partner in crime and profligacy. Whither will he lead thee, if not to that abyss and to that Sodom in which he himself is living, but which God will destroy with the flame of his anger? But I say to thee, would thou hadst died, would the walls of this house had fallen on thy head before that serpent had crept into thy bosom and beslimed it with the poison of iniquity." And he was borne away more and more, for Lygia's fault filled him not only with anger but with loathing and contempt for human nature in general, and in particular for women, whom even Christian truth could not save from Eve's weakness. To him it seemed nothing that the maiden had remained pure, that she wished to flee from that love, that she had confessed it with compunction and penitence. Crispus had wished to transform her into an angel, to raise her to heights where love for Christ alone existed, and she had fallen in love with an Augustine. The very thought of that filled his heart with horror, strengthened by a feeling of disillusion and disappointment. No, no, he could not forgive her. Words of horror burned his lips like glowing coals. He struggled still with himself not to utter them, but he shook his emaciated hands over the terrified girl. Lygia felt guilty, but not to that degree. She had judged even that withdrawal from Miriam's house would be her victory over temptation, and would lessen her fault. Crispus rubbed her into the dust, showed her all the misery and insignificance of her soul, which she had not suspected hitherto. She had judged even that the old presbyter, who from the moment of her flight from the Palatine had been to her as a father, would show some compassion, console her, give her courage, and strengthen her. "I offer my pain and disappointment to God," said he, "but thou hast deceived the Savior also, for thou hast gone as it were to a quagmire which has poisoned thy soul with its miasma. Thou mightst have offered it to Christ as a costly vessel, and said to him, Fill it with grace, O Lord. But thou hast preferred to offer it to the servant of the evil one. May God forgive thee and have mercy on thee, for till thou cast out the serpent, I who held thee as chosen. But he ceased suddenly to speak, for he saw that they were not alone. Through the withered vines and the ivy, which was green alike in summer and winter, he saw two men, one of whom was Peter the apostle. The other he was unable to recognize at once, for a mantle of coarse woolen stuff, called cilicium, concealed a part of his face. It seemed to Crispus for a moment that it was Shiloh. They, hearing the loud voice of Crispus, entered the summer house and sat on a stone bench. Peter's companion had an emaciated face. His head, which was growing bald, was covered at the sides with curly hair. He had reddened eyelids and a crooked nose. In the face, ugly and at the same time inspired, Crispus recognized the features of Paul of Tarsus. Lygia, casting herself on her knees, embraced Peter's feet, as if from despair, and, sheltering her tortured head in the fold of his mantle, remained thus in silence. Peace to your souls, said Peter. And seeing the child at his feet he asked what had happened. Crispus began then to narrate all that Lygia had confessed to him, her sinful love, her desire to flee from Miriam's house, and his sorrow that a soul which he had thought to offer to Christ pure as its air had defiled itself with earthly feelings for a sharer in all those crimes into which the pagan world had sunk, and which called for God's vengeance. Lygia during his speech embraced with increasing force the feet of the apostle, as if wishing to seek refuge near them, and to beg even a little compassion. But the apostle, when he had listened to the end, bent down and placed his aged hand on her head. Then he raised his eyes to the old presbyter, and said, Crispus, hast thou not heard that our beloved master was in Cana, at a wedding, and blessed love between man and woman? Crispus's hands dropped, and he looked with astonishment on the speaker, without power to utter one word. After a moment's silence Peter asked again, Crispus, dost thou think that Christ, who permitted Mary of Magdala to lie at his feet, and who forgave the public sinner, would turn from this maiden, who is as pure as a lily of the field? Lygia nestled up more urgently to the feet of Peter, with sobbing, understanding that she had not sought refuge in vain. The apostle raised her face, which was covered with tears, and said to her, While the eyes of him whom thou lovest are not open to the light of truth, avoid him, lest he bring thee to sin, but pray for him, and know that there is no sin in thy love. And since it is thy wish to avoid temptation, this will be accounted to thee as a merit. Do not suffer, and do not weep, for I tell thee that the grace of the Redeemer has not deserted thee, and that thy prayers will be heard. After sorrow will come days of gladness. When he had said this, he placed both hands on her head, and, raising his eyes, blessed her. From his face there shone a goodness beyond that of earth. The penitent Crispus began humbly to explain himself. I have sinned against mercy, said he, but I thought that by admitting to her heart an earthly love she had denied Christ. I denied him thrice, answered Peter, and still he forgave me, and commanded me to feed his sheep. And because, concluded Crispus, Vinicius is an Augustine. Christ softened harder hearts than his, replied Peter. Then Paul of Tarsus, who had been silent so far, placed his finger on his breast, pointing to himself, and said, I am he who persecuted and hurried servants of Christ to their death. I am he who during the stoning of Stephen kept the garments of those who stoned him. I am he who wished to root out the truth in every part of the inhabited earth, and yet the Lord predestined me to declare it in every land. I have declared it in Judea, in Greece, on the islands, and in this godless city, where first I resided as a prisoner. And now when Peter, my superior, has summoned me, I enter this house to bend the proud head to the feet of Christ, and cast a grain of seed in that stony field, which the Lord will fertilize, so that it may bring forth a bountiful harvest. And he rose. To Crispus that diminutive hunchback seemed then that which he was in reality, a giant, who was to stir the world to its foundations and gather in lands and nations,